Good to be with you today. Great to see you. We're going to be in the book of 2nd Chronicles. We're going to be in the 15th chapter. Grateful to be at your church. I want to thank you for one specific thing. We were doing interviews yesterday of ministers, ministerial students, and Pastor Josh met with us, and he was here with you for many years, and you as a church nurtured him, encouraged him, and he now is serving another church. That's not easy to do. What a lot of people want to do is hang on to everybody, right? We're going to hang on to everybody, but we're thankful for what he's done. Grateful for your pastor and wife. 25 years, he's about to get it figured out. It takes 30 years to figure it out, so he's getting close. Actually, I hope you know this, there is a direct correlation between the length of a pastorate and the health of a church. And the longer that length is, the healthier the church. Some churches every 3 or 4 years just say, well, we're going to recycle and do something again, and they wonder why they don't accomplish anything or have that presence in the community. So thanks, Pastor James, Suzanne, for your service here. Revival's a word we used to talk about all the time, and you don't hear as much anymore. So when I first started out in the ministry 150 years ago, or however long, it was a long time ago, you had revival twice a year. Usually the speakers just traveled from church to church to church, and they couldn't remember where they were. They would always call it, like if I was the pastor, they'd call me brother pastor, and then my wife was sister pastor's wife, and so they would just come in. But it was important, and I think that the fact that y'all are going into revival tonight, I wanted to kind of piggyback on that and tell you how important it is and what goes along with revival. Now, all of us have seen these medical commercials on TV, right? And they say, oh, if you've got this problem or that problem. So let's say it's one and they say, oh, you got some splotchy skin right here on your arm. Well, here's this drug you can take for it. And so they tell you about the drug. And then when they get to the end of the commercial, you know what happens. They got this guy that speaks about 1,000 miles an hour, and he tells you all the things that go along with it. In other words, these are the side effects, if you will. And I mean, it's like if you take this, you'll probably go blind in one eye, and maybe an extremity will fall off. Your digestive system won't work anymore. You'll lose your memory, but praise God, that blotch will be off your arm, right? And you're just like, man, I'm not taking that stuff. Well, when revival comes, true revival, there's some things that always come with it, and that's what I want us to look at. We're in this passage where we got a good king of Israel. Got good kings and bad kings, and the bad kings were always saying, hey, let's take the gods of this culture. Let's take those gods and let's worship them. And the good kings would say, hey, you know what? When we were really doing well, it's when we focused on God and did what God wanted. And so we have a prophet coming on the scene here. Now, what did prophets do? Well, prophets would kind of speak to the people and just say, here's what God said to me. God told me to share this. And they would speak. And sometimes they would speak those things and literally not know how it's going to come out. I mean, some prophecies, it took 500 years for them to come about. Some of the prophecies were so obscure that you would think that could never happen. But it did happen again and again as God's words came through. So Azariah is the prophet here. And let me tell you, as a preacher, as a pastor, your pastor may feel the same way. Sometimes it's just the change of a voice, just hearing a different voice. So like you're in church and let's say your pastor's been teaching on Revelation for 6 months. And I mean, he has covered everything. I mean, you know who the 4 horsemen are. You know what kind of saddles are on the horses. You know the last time they were shooting. He cover everything. And then some guest comes in and says, hey, in the last days, things are going to get really crazy. And people are like, oh, that's so deep. That's so deep that they shared that. And so a prophet's a different voice. And so Azariah comes along, and that's what we're hearing. Asa is the king. Now, let me say this. A lot of times people think revival comes after a really bad time, but they weren't really in a bad spot. Some good things that happened to them. So they weren't like in desperate need, but God knew that they needed to be more like him. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. 2 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 1 says this. The Spirit of God came upon Azariah, the son of Oded, and he went out to meet Asa and said to him, listen to me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you when you are with him, and if you seek him, he'll be found by you. But if you forsake him, he'll forsake you. For a long time Israel was without the true God, without a priest to teach, and without the law. But in their distress they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, and he was found by them. Lord, help us to remember and to see what happens when revival comes. I pray that in your name. Amen. So I want to give you 4 things that happen when revival comes. So, the first one, your pastor actually stole my first point in the children's sermon. That's why I have 4. You know, pastors always have 3, but since he's going to steal one of mine, I've got 4. So the first one is this. When revival comes, there's a real sense of God's presence. And it's not something you can explain, right? You can't be like down at the grocery store and say, hey, the Lord was really there. You'll try to explain to people his presence was so real. And usually you end up saying something like this, well, you just had to be there. If you were there, you would see it. You would know, you would understand. And so it's about his presence. So his presence is kind of, as the pastor said in the children's sermon, it's something we're a little strange about. Because we pray what we call the invocation, right? The invocation is asking God to be with us. But we don't have to ask God to be with us. He's already here. There's not a time that a service has been held in this church that the Lord wasn't here. And he's not just here. He's in a hospital room where somebody's close to passing away, or the hospice room of your loved one you talked about. He's in the hospital where a new baby was born. He's in where the worst thing. God's presence is there. I think what it is we have to understand his presence. We have to connect with his presence. In fact, in the Old Testament, they would talk about God's presence being manifest. Now, that's not a word we use very often, right? I mean, when's the last time, just in common conversation, you use the word manifest? What is a manifest? Manifest is a list of people who actually made the trip, right? Not the people who made reservations and backed out, not the people who were late for the plane, or let's say the church van. It was actually the people who were on the journey. The people who were there. So manifest means, hey, these are the people that actually caught God's presence. They actually realized that he was there. I worked for a hospice in our first couple of churches. There were smaller churches, and I was working for hospice as a chaplain. And I went in like my first visit, and I went into the house, and then I realized, wait a minute, I'm in the house of a young man here who's been told he just has days to live. How do you pray about that, right? I mean, so they've said he's beyond healing. Of course, God can heal. What do you do? And so I learned then that the greatest prayer we can pray is that people would sense God's presence, that they would know God was there with them. Because we can go through just about anything if we know he's with us. It's the first church I pastored. Our vice chairman was a real character. His brother was a Wesleyan pastor. His father was a Wesleyan pastor. His brother was a Wesleyan missionary. I told him he was the black sheep of the family. His sister actually married a Wesleyan pastor. Wesleyan everywhere. And he was just a real character. So it came up, it was his 50th birthday. Now, we had a real small church in Charlotte. We rented a fellowship hall, and I still don't know how this came about, but somehow the family got a casket. So we're there for his birthday party, and they just roll this thing up front. And the party was people giving eulogies for him, but he was there. I mean, so we're going on, and at one point somebody said, I miss Harlan so much, and he said, I'm right here. And the person said, it's like I can still hear him. It's like he's still there. And so sometimes I think we're praying and saying, God be in the service, God be with us, God please come. And he's here. His presence is here. His presence is real. When revival comes, you realize that. I can tell you, every week we're in a different church. And we go and speak or visit, and we have 102 churches in the district. It takes a little while to get around. You can sense God's presence in some. I mean, it's like you pull in the parking lot and you're like, oh my goodness. And his presence is real. So that's when God's presence is real, that's when things can happen and will happen in an amazing way. So we want to have his presence. The second thing is conviction. Now, let me go back. Presence, it said, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. That's the same word as creation. In other words, God was there. Then he says in verse 2, the prophet says, listen to me. When there's a real sense of revival, there's also a sense of conviction. Right? Conviction is a powerful thing, because when the Lord convicts you of something, you cannot get away from it. Now, if your spouse says, well, I think you ought to do this, or you ought to do that, or you ought to change your diet, or you ought to, you're just kind of like, okay, how do I get away from there? How do I go another way? How do I do? Somebody comes and says, you ought to do this. People say that's one. But when God tells us, here's the problem. God knows everything about us, and we can't look back at Him and say, oh, yeah, this is really not a good time, Lord. And like the Lord would say, oh, I didn't realize that. I'm so sorry I asked. I wasn't really paying attention to your life. So God asks us to do something. He convicts us. Literally, the word conviction means to convince. And when revival comes, God's presence is real. People become convinced or convicted. Now, let me tell you what we preachers do sometimes. I'm sure your pastor's never done this, but sometimes we think we're going to help the Lord out. And we're going to tell a story, or we're going to do something, and that will help people get convicted. And I think God uses stories and He uses preaching, but it's a mistake if we begin to think we can say something to someone and we can maneuver that. What we have to do is say, God, you convict them. So the last church I pastored before I started serving the district, on Sunday nights, they had small groups, and they met in people's homes, and they had like 150 people in all these different homes. And so I'm making my tour from house to house, and it's about 4 or 5 weeks in, and so I pull up where the house is. I'm new to the area. I'm thinking I'm at the right place, and I start to go in. And have you ever gone somewhere and you can tell somebody they've kind of drawn a bead on you, and they are going to talk to you whether you like it or not? Does that ever happen? Like you see them at Walmart, you can duck back behind the aisle and sneak out the back door and all that. But this lady's just kind of looking. And so I get out of the car, and she said, are you the pastor? Now, what I wanted to say is, why? right? I said, yes, ma'am, I'm the pastor. She said, well, I want to know if I can come to your church here. And I thought, well, actually, it's not a church, it's the house. And I said, well, sure, you can come. We'd be happy to have you. She said, well, not everybody feels that way. And I thought, this is not getting any better as it goes on, right? This is not getting. And so I said, ma'am, why would you say that? If somebody in our church, she said, no, it's not your church. It's another church I went to. And she said, the pastor was preaching, and at the end of the service, he said that thing down front. She didn't know the word for altar, that thing down front. I said, the altar. She said, yeah. She said, the pastor said that altar was an airplane headed to heaven. And the only way you get to heaven is if you get on that airplane. And she said, everybody in the church went down front except for me and a deaf lady. And he said, she didn't know what he was saying. She said, and my daughter was so embarrassed. She said, well, then the pastor comes out to her. I mean, it's not enough to have the altar call. He comes right out to her and he says, ma'am, did you not understand what I said? She said, well, I think so. He said, what did I say? She said, well, you said that down the front down there is a airplane. You got to get on that airplane, and that's the only way you get to heaven. He said, do you not want to go to heaven? She said, oh, yeah, I want to go to heaven. She said, but to tell you the truth, I know some of those people down there. I don't know where that plane's heading. Right? All I could think of is, she's probably going to come to church soon, and it's going to be a real amazing day. She was fine the rest of the time. But what happened? That pastor was going to convince people of something. Our business is not to convince people. Now, we can talk to people and encourage them, but it's God that brings about heart change, right? It's not us that can make people change their heart. When I was a teenager in my home church on Sunday nights in the summer, they would have what they called lay witness night, and a couple of nights a month, a lay person would lead the service. So I loved that as a teenager, because you never knew what was going to happen, right? I mean, you just never knew. And so we went one night, and a guy named Clarence was speaking. Now, Clarence was one of the top car salesmen in all of Asheville, and so he got up that night, and we finished the songs and all that. And he had an old Big Ben alarm clock, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Will you wind it? Now, if you're younger, I can't help you. Just take your phone out and Google it. That's the best thing. And so I know this is amazing, but we used to carry clocks around because we didn't have clocks on our phones because our phones were attached to the wall, right? And so he began to wind that thing. And when they wind it, you know how those old Big Ben alarms, it sounds kind of like most of us older people, our back does in the morning when you get, it's just kind of this grinding sound. He's winding it, he's winding. And while he's winding it, now the thing with those Big Bens, they got two bells on top, and when they go off, it's like being in the fire station, right? You don't sleep through those things for the most part. He's winding it up, and he says, it's 6:30. He said, what if I told you, he's holding that clock up, that the Lord will be back by 7 o'clock at the latest? Is there anything you'd like to say to him? He sits that clock on the communion table and goes and sits down. And I won't forget, everybody kind of looked at each other like, can he do that? Isn't he supposed to do a message? And people kind of looked around for a minute, then one by one, people started going to the altar. Now, nobody in there was thinking, and he didn't say the Lord was going to be back. What he was trying to say is imagine that the Lord will be back. Is there anything you'd like to talk to him about? Is there anything you'd like to say? And God did the convincing, and the convicting, if you will. Now the third thing that happens, it says in verse 3, for a long time they didn't have the true God, but they turned to the Lord and they found him, and he was found by them, it said. It's kind of a spiritual word you don't hear a lot, but this is a key in revival, is reconciliation. Okay? Now, here's the reconciliation. We usually think about racial reconciliation. We're trying to get along with people and things like that. But reconcile means that there's something out of alignment. Did you hear that in the video a while ago? Prayer is bringing ourselves in alignment with God. That's how we figured out. There's something out of alignment. Doesn't mean that you're an axe murderer or you're in a motorcycle gang, that you're a drug dealer. Doesn't mean, it just means there's something in you that's out of alignment. That's something that God needs to bring back into alignment. Now, younger people, you're going to have to use your phones again. But let me tell you, like now is like a cash or electronic society. Let me tell you what we used to do, us older people. First, we'd go out and shoot and kill an animal. We'd tan the hide, and we'd make what we called a checkbook cover, right? And then we would cut down a tree, and we'd get the papyrus, and we would make these things called checks. I know this is amazing sound. And you would actually write the person's name on there, and the amount of money you want them to have, and you give it to them, it was like money. Now, some of you older people are like, this is not funny at all. I still use checks, right? I mean, we needed to pay for something with a check, and it took us like an hour to find our check, but we had no idea where it was because you just don't use it that much. Well, here's what happens back in the day when people use checkbooks. At the end of the month, the bank sends a statement, right? And that statement shows all your deposits, all your withdrawals, and yes, all your checks. And what you would do is you would say, the bank has the correct record. I've got to take their records and make sure that my checkbook aligns with it. Because it's a problem if you think you got $500 in the bank and you only have $5 in the bank, right? So you'd figure out this, I got to figure out how much I got. And that was what you were doing, is you were saying the bank has the right amount. They have the truth. I've got to bring myself into alignment with that. I'm going to reconcile. I'm going to see what they say. Well, this is what happens with the Lord. We're out of alignment, if you will. And again, revival always starts with God's people. You ever heard somebody stand up in church and say, we just need a revival. We need to get a bunch of lost people in here. Well, that's not the way revival starts. Revival starts with God's people, and as they reconcile or bring things into alignment with God, and that changes them, it changes how we act and behave, and then that changes other people. The last thing that happens in revival is, okay, so God's presence was real. we're convicted because of some way that he leads us, and it's his conviction, right? So it's very hard, again, to say, if the Lord says, hey, this thing in your life is not helping you, it's hard to say, well, Lord, you don't understand. This is something I need. No, the Lord understands everything. So he convicts. Then you bring that into alignment. You bring that back the way it's supposed to be, and it changes you. You know what happened with Asa? Asa's got a problem. He's trying to change things so they get back to worshiping God. You know what his problem was? The Bible calls it the Queen Mother. It's actually his grandmother. His grandmother had been pretty much running the country, and she had been worshiping idols. Now, I don't know about y'all. I'm from the mountains a little farther west. Where I'm from, Grandma's like in charge of everything. You don't mess with Grandma, right? I mean, maybe that's not that way around it, but that's the way it was. And so he's got this problem. Go all the way back to COVID. I'm assuming y'all had COVID here. I mean, I'm not sure it got everywhere, but I don't know if y'all heard about that or not, because there's hardly anything on the news about it. You would never. But back during that time, do you remember how they would like do an hour earlier for like seniors at the store so they could come and shop together? Okay, 3 of you remember that. The rest of you don't remember COVID, or you're just trying to figure out what your lunch order is. So anyway, so they would do that. I told my wife, I said, I think the grocery stores need to have an hour where only men can come. Right? Because like, I'm sure it's not this way in Lenoir, but where I live, it's like you get bullied in the grocery store by ladies, right? You go in and they just look at you like, what are you doing here? This is my store. Why did you come? Oh, you're going to take a buggy now? You think you're taking it? Don't get in my way. So I go in the store one day, and this little old lady standing there, and when I got one of those little tiny buggies. You know, for men, you don't want to push a buggy. You don't get, so I got one of those little things, and she's just looking at me like, you're in my store, and I don't like it. And I just looked at her like, listen, I'm getting out of your way. You won't see me again. So I go back and I'm starting to pick things up. Now, the problem with me going to the grocery store is rarely do I come home with the things I'm supposed to come home with, right? But I always come home with something that usually is more geared toward what I want. This is why men don't get to go to the grocery store very much, because we're not very good at it. So I go in and my, you know, I told my wife I was going by again. And I said, she sent me a list. And so I'm trying to find things, and you know how I'm sure the rest of you are wonderful, but I'm just kind of like, why don't they have a sign for pickled relish on the end of the row? How am I supposed to know where all that is? You know, I'm trying to find all this. And then if you're a man, you lose your man card if you actually ask somebody, right? I mean, you can't say, where is this? Because if you ask that, then you're not a man, and you just lost your man card, because that's the same thing as asking for directions. And so I'm going around, I'm trying to find it, and this lady, everywhere I go, it's like she's stalking me, except she's there before I am, which is even worse than stalking. I turn down one aisle, and she's a little tiny lady with her buggy, but somehow physically, she's got the entire aisle blocked. And she just looks at me like, this is my aisle. You're not coming down this aisle. And I just looked at, I get it. I'll go somewhere else, you know. So I go around, and I finally get, one of the things my wife had is blue tortilla chips, which I am pretty sure Jesus never ate blue tortilla chips. But anyway, I didn't even know they existed. So I go in, and I'm looking, and to make it even worse, there's like 4 kinds of blue tortilla chips. So I did what any decent man would have done. I took my phone, took a picture, texted to my wife, and said, is this it? Right? Listen, guys, this is how we stay married. That used to break families up, but now we got phones, we can do stuff like that. And she sends back and tells me it's right. And then I hear this, what sounds like a Harley Davidson behind me, and this little old lady clearing her throat like, you're in my aisle again. Now, my whole point is, sometimes God will ask us to do something, and you're like, anything but that, right? Lord, listen, I'll go to the mission field, just don't ask me to do that. But he has a reason for that. And I'm pretty sure if we get to interview Ace up in heaven and say, hey, what was it like when God told you to get rid of all the idols and your grandmother was running idol worship in the country? My guess is he's going to say, that was a tough one. But you know what he did? He went to her and said, you're no longer in charge. You're done, because we're going to honor God here. And what you've been doing is not honoring God. You're welcome to join us, but we have to honor God. I think that we don't see revival as much as we did at one time. And obviously this is scattered. Some places do, some places don't. But it was always that sense of revival and that conviction and that reconciliation that drove us to do things that were important to the Lord. I don't know if y'all, I'm pretty sure you've noticed this. We live in a pretty messed up country, don't we? If you'd have told me 10 years ago that somebody could become a Supreme Court justice when they couldn't answer the question, what is a woman? I would have said, you have lost your mind. Nobody would do that. If you would have told me some of the things that are happening in our culture, I would have, that is unbelievable. I just can't believe that would happen. But it is. We're having at General Conference this year, we're having to update our standard, our statement on gender. Because our statement right now just says follow scriptural teachings with gender. Well, your kids that were up here in kids, they're being taught in school there's multiple genders. There's many, many genders. And so if they don't hear the truth here in church, where else are they going to hear it? And so there's all these things that we have to do. I'm reminded of one of the first stories I ever heard when I became, actually was called to the ministry, and it was at youth camp that week. And the evangelist was telling us about a doctor that went to Africa to do cataract surgery. That's a pretty simple surgery, right? But especially in those, even now, if you've got cataracts, right, and they take that, you're like, oh, I can see again. It's kind of an amazing thing. So in a third world country, they went over and they were doing these surgeries. And so one of the first ones they did was this little man in the village, and then they were looking for him. They were supposed to come back. They were only there for a week or so. They're supposed to come back in a few days. They were going to give him a final check before they left, because you can have some complications with cataracts, but most part it's easy. They can't find this man. He's just gone. They don't know where he is. They've asked all the neighbors about him. They've asked the people in the village. It's like he's always where people can find him. Now they can't find him. And they said they were getting ready to leave on the last day, and they look over a hill in the distance, and the guy's coming back. And behind him are people with their hands on each other's shoulder. He went and found everybody who couldn't see and said, hey, I couldn't see either, but they did something for me. They did this surgery, and now I can see again. Come with me and see what it's like. Folks, that's evangelism. Evangelism's not getting all your lines ready and ready to go and knocking on somebody's door and doing battle. You can do that. But the purest form of evangelism is saying to somebody, guess what I was like before God did this for me? What did the guys, remember they're trying to convict him and get Jesus in trouble. What did Jesus do and what did he say before he healed? Do you remember what the guy said? Best testimony in the Bible. All I can tell you, I used to be blind. Now I can see. Amen. That's what we have to tell people. And I bet, pastor's not supposed to bet, I would hazard a guess. How's that? Okay. I guess most of you are I don't care if you're retired or if you're in school, you're around people constantly who are saying, I've got this thing in my life and I don't know what to do. And you don't have to be a know-it-all. You can just simply say, I understand. I was there once, and if it wasn't for the Lord, I don't know where I'd be now. And you know what they'll usually say? Tell me more about this Lord. You know why we don't do that? When I talk to people, why we don't, sometimes we're afraid of what people might think. Most of the time people say, what if somebody asks me a question I don't know the answer to? That's easy for me. I don't know the answer to most every question, so it's not very daunting for me. But it's just, I've given this illustration before. Let's say there's a great new restaurant in town, and you want to you're coming to church this morning, the place just opened, you've been there, and I mean, the prices are great, the food's great and all that, and you're walking in the parking lot and you're like, I'm going to tell some people about this great new restaurant so they can find out about it and they can go. And then it hits you, I don't know every item on the menu. What if they ask me how much the cucumber salad is? First of all, I don't know any good restaurants that have cucumber salad, but that's a different thing. So what if you don't think that way. If they say to you, oh, really? Well, do they have a special on such and such? You say, I don't know, but I can find out, or you can look at the menu. You don't stop from telling people because you don't know everything. You just tell them what you do know. I've stood up here and preached, and I've watched blurs of cars go by, knowing that 4 out of 5 of those cars that pass here during the service, and that you'll pass on the way home. In Lenoir, I'm not talking about LA, I'm not talking about New York City. In Lenoir, 4 out of 5 of those cars were not in a church service today. We have foreign countries where we used to send missionaries who are sending missionaries back to our country because the number of lost people in our country is greater than anywhere else. Now here's the last thing, and then when I was coming up and I was much younger, there was kind of everybody knew about church and religion and made their decision. The people that didn't go were pretty hardened, right? I mean, they just said, maybe they were disappointed by something that happened, or they just didn't believe, and it was hard. That's not the case now. These 4 out of 5 people are driving by. They're not anti-church. A few of them might be. Most of them have no idea what happens in here. We're now in a place in the culture where you've got people they have never been in a church in their life. They're not against it. They just don't know. In fact, they drive by and they see cars and they're like, I wonder why those people do that. Somebody just needs to tell them. Somebody just needs to say, hey, here's what we do there. We come and we worship, and we worship, and we do this not because we want to get something for God. That's kind of backwards. Some people say, well, I'm going to do all this so I can get to heaven. I can get this. Really what we say is because of what He's done for me. That's why I'm there. I'm there because God's done this work for me. And I could go the rest of my life. I could never do enough to pay Him back. I want to be a part of His kingdom. So I want to encourage you. If you weren't thinking about going to revival, or if you try to make some services. People have been praying for this, asking God to move. It could be something that is a major difference in your life. Would you stand? I'm going to close in prayer now. Dismiss or turn back to you? Okay, I'm going to turn back to Father, thank you for revival. Thank you for reminding us it starts with God's people. It's never a story if all those lost people would come to church, we'd have revival. It's a story if God's people would draw closer to Him, we'd have revival, and the whole community would be impacted. Thank you for someone like Asa, who honored your presence, heard your convincing or conviction, realigned his life, and was willing to make the difficult choices that would put the nation in the best place to move forward. God, make us people like that. I pray it in your name. Amen.